This is the National Broadcasting Company, RCA Building, Radio City, New York. The story behind the headlines, presented by the American Historical Association in cooperation with the National Broadcasting Company with Caesar Searchinger. Each week, Mr. Searchinger, noted foreign correspondent, radio commentator, and author, discusses dominant news events either in our own country or abroad and sketches the historical background leading up to them. This evening, Mr. Searchinger's subject is Great Britain and the Four-Power Pact. Ladies and gentlemen, Caesar Searchinger brings you the story behind the headlines.
Good evening, everybody. Last March, in the first talk of this series, I had occasion to speak of British foreign policy. The big headline during that week was Anthony Eden resigns as Foreign Secretary. And when we reflect that that was less than 8 months ago, we see how fast and how furiously history is being made today. Britain girds for future crises is a typical headline these days. The resignation of Eden marked the end of the League of Nations system of collective security in Europe, and the beginning of what may be called the Chamberlain system of direct negotiation, which was to mean sitting down to talk turkey to the dictators instead of making faces at them from behind a barrage of high principles. This system eventually led, quite logically, to the conferences of Berchtesgaden, Godesberg, and Munich. I tried to point out in this earlier talk that Chamberlain, while breaking with recent practice, was not breaking with British tradition or long-range policy. Chiefly concerned with the security of Great Britain and the Empire, that policy was to keep the peace in Europe by means of a balance of power, seeing to it that the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, never fell into dangerous hands, and naval supremacy assuring the command of the seas. Now, when I come to look back at recent happenings, I must say that he hasn't really departed from that policy during the critical weeks. Before we talk about the present, about the new Europe arising out of the Four-Power Pact, let's trace that policy to its source. Let's consider Britain in its essential historical aspects, as the center of a world empire, as the center of a system of world trade, and, incidentally, as the champion of democratic government. It's the story of a small island people living on the edge of, and happily detached from, a large continent which has been the storm center of most of the great world conflicts for over 1,000 years. Facing the sea, looking out upon the wide world in its search for wealth, it has managed to keep that cockpit in its rear from interfering, while it united the sixth of the globe under one flag and seized the lion's share of the world's trade. Yet, in the 19th century, Britain's trade, though secured by her navy, was free, open to all who would take advantage of it. That was one of the important things about the so-called Pax Britannica, the peace which brought prosperity both to Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. And the other was the famous balance of power, which goes back to the days of Cardinal Wolsey, the butcher's son who became Henry VIII's chief minister. England was a weak country then, of little importance to Europe. Wolsey's idea was to prevent any power in Europe from becoming overwhelmingly strong by creating two roughly even groups, and to throw England's weight from one to the other, never allowing either of them to count on her constant support. During the next 200 years, 3 European powers, one after the other, seemed to be aiming at what the English called universal dominion, or world mastery: the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French. When Spain, united with the Habsburg Empire, mastered the continent, Wolsey gravitated towards France, hitherto the traditional enemy. And you all know what happened to the Spanish Armada in 1588. When Spain had been conquered and the East Indian trade opened to Englishmen, England fought the Dutch 3 times in the course of the 17th century. And when the Dutch ceased to seem great rivals, and the colossal power of France threatened English security and English markets, England fought France in 7 separate wars from 1689 to 1815. From the 17th century on, England joined one coalition after another for that purpose, such as the Triple Alliance and the Grand Alliance, to curb the aggression of Louis XIV, whose scheme to combine France and Spain under one royal house would have directly threatened an invasion of England from the Spanish Netherlands. John Churchill, by the way, Duke of Marlborough, was the hero of that fight to curb Louis, And it's a descendant of his, Winston Churchill, who is now saying that Hitler is just another Louis XIV aiming at world dominion, and that just as England had then to get rid of a pro-French king, James II, so she must now get rid of her pro-German ministers. Throughout the whole 18th century, except a few years after the Peace of Utrecht, England and France were deadly rivals. Towards the end of the century, French revolutionary armies went on the rampage, supported by an ideology as repugnant to Englishmen then as Adolf Hitler's is today. Pretty soon, that great totalitarian Napoleon Bonaparte swept like a hurricane over Europe, completely destroying the balance of power, breaking international treaties, and directly challenging England's safety. Of the four coalitions against Napoleon, England was the chief instigator and always his most feared enemy. When Napoleon was broken by Nelson's victories at Trafalgar and elsewhere, and by the last great continental coalition against him, England emerged with Holland and Belgium a single independent nation and with additional colonial gains. For though she had lost America, her second empire was already being built up thanks to the audacity of British traders and trading companies in India and Africa. Her Mediterranean domination, begun with the acquisition of Gibraltar and Minorca in 1713, became complete with Disraeli's purchase of the Suez shares in 1875 and the lifeline of the empire. By now, Great Britain had become an industrial nation. She was now dependent on her overseas trade not only for her wealth, but for her subsistence. From a small farming nation of 6 million people at the beginning of the 18th century, she'd grown to be a country of some 25 millions, largely urbanized, when Queen Victoria's Prime Minister brought back peace with honor from the Congress of Berlin, a peace that kept affairs quiet in Europe's trouble house, the Balkans, for just 20 years. Whether Mr. Chamberlain's peace with honor, with its implications for the future of the Balkans, will serve equally well is for posterity to decide. Throughout the 19th century, Britain did not intervene by force of arms on the continent, except for the Crimean War, whipped up by British jingoes against the supposedly threatening power of Russia. Most historians would admit nowadays that it was a mistake to keep Russia from having an outlet to the sea. Would it be a similar mistake, perhaps, to keep Germany from expanding now? But there were two other powerful forces working in 19th century Europe. The English people's sympathies were deeply engaged in them, and these were the rising forces of nationalism and democracy. Whatever their material interests, Englishmen could always be enlisted to support nationalist aspirations of peoples and struggles for a more liberal form of government. England's imperial policy might call for the maintenance of Turkey, but Gladstone could arouse the indignation of the whole nation by his exposure of the despotic atrocities of the unspeakable Turk. And by the way, a recent echo of Gladstone's eloquence was Austen Chamberlain's phrase about the unspeakable Nazi dictatorship. But just as Disraeli went to talk things over with Bismarck and the Turks in Berlin, so Chamberlain's brother Neville decided to talk things over at Munich rather than fight. Failure at Berlin would have meant a European war against Russia and her allies. Failure at Munich might have meant a world war against Germany and her allies. Failure in either place would have meant a deflection of policy from Britain's principal aims, as a trading nation, the maintenance of peace, as an imperial nation, the safety of her empire. In fulfilling these two necessities, Mr. Chamberlain may be said to have subordinated England's traditional championship of democracy and the small nations. Many people in England, as elsewhere, are saying that the present situation resembles that which faced England in the times of Louis XIV and Napoleon, and that he should have fought rather than make terms. Who is right? Controversy is rife, too, on the question of who betrayed Czechoslovakia, England or France, or both. All we can say by consulting history is that war, in the circumstances, would not have been in the line of British policy. Britain doesn't fight on the continent for political principles alone. She has fought when the dominant power in Europe became too strong for safety, and she has fought for the aggrandizement and safety of her empire overseas. The first question then is, has Hitler become too strong? The second, how would the empire have fared in case of war? Let's compare the present with the situation in 1914. The ideal cause then was the saving of little Belgium, just as the ideal cause this time would have been the saving of little Czechoslovakia. But in 1914, besides saving Belgium, Britain was destroying a dangerous competitor in the capital markets of the world. Today, Germany is financially weak. In 1914, Britain was despoiling a colonial power. Today, Germany has nothing worth taking. In 1914, Britain was fighting her only serious rival at sea, a rival who refused to sign a naval pact. Today, Britain has her Anglo-German naval pact. By giving way to Hitler in Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain was giving him free access to the Balkans, a free hand in building up his economic empire in the southeast. Well, England has long been in favor of a single strong power in the Balkans, and this will help to satisfy Hitler's need for raw materials and his quest for new markets, thus easing his competition with the Western countries overseas. Why, even this week, Mr. Walter Funk, Hitler's Minister of Economy, outlined a plan for developing these resources in accordance with German requirements, in exchange for the manufactured goods with which the 60 million inhabitants of the Balkans can be made to absorb. Germany will give them capital goods, things like railways and equipment for the army, etc. True, this all will make Germany commercially strong, but not at Britain's expense. Now, as regards the empire, Britain has everything to lose, even by a victorious war. Never has her far-flung empire been so vulnerable as it is today. Germany and Italy are both astride the Mediterranean lifeline. Italy, in case of war, would go for Palestine with the help of the Arabs, and for Egypt. And Japan would threaten her Far Eastern possessions. And the crux of the whole matter is that the British Navy, which has for 2.5 centuries kept the empire together, may be reduced to an impotent and useless force when attacked by the new weapon of the 20th century, the armadas of the air. This is the terrible problem to which some Englishmen find no answer. England herself has never been seriously invaded since the Middle Ages, until the last war when bombs fell on London. Now all Englishmen know how vulnerable to air attack is their ancient capital, and they cannot be sure that the Dominions would come to their assistance as readily as in 1914. But what, you will ask, about this balance of power? Well, as in 1815 by the Concert of Europe, so in 1938 by the Four-Power Pact, the balance is assured for a time. For within this pact, Italy is a possible counterweight to Germany, thanks to her treaties with Yugoslavia and Hungary. In the long run, one may speculate Russia is more likely to be matched against Greater Germany, with Britain, France, and possibly Italy holding the balance between the two. But whatever may happen in that line, the alliance between France and Britain has become indispensable to both. And, as Lord Baldwin has said, Britain's frontier is now definitely on the Rhine. Another thing seems certain. France's system of Eastern alliances is in tatters, and the Franco-Russian Pact, for practical purposes, a thing of the past. Britain's distaste for these commitments has been obvious ever since they were made, and it was a decisive factor in the late crisis. The plain truth is that despite her democratic ideals, Britain has never fought and will not now fight a purely ideological war. Her course now, under Chamberlain's leadership, is the one she has always followed before, to come to terms with the first power on the continent, to meet around a table and compromise, to persuade Hitler that he will get more in the end by keeping his promises. And meanwhile, of course, to strengthen her own defenses and improve her relations with the United States. It was not surprising to see Anthony Eden and Winston Churchill just now making overtures to America for a world democratic front. And it is interesting to learn, too, that King George and Queen Elizabeth are to visit President Roosevelt next year. Good night to you.
Copies of these talks, The Story Behind the Headlines, by Caesar Setchinger, are available in printed form. They are issued by the Columbia University Press in the form of a bulletin which includes additional material and bibliography. They may be had for 10 cents apiece or $1 for the first 13 issues by addressing The Story Behind the Headlines, NBC, Radio City. This program, presented by the American Historical Association, is an NBC educational feature. This is the National Broadcasting Company.